The Russian sleep experiment is a chilling tale that takes place in the late 1940s in the shadowy world of Cold War-era Soviet research. It's a story about pushing human endurance to the breaking point, a test of what happens when science and morality collide in a horrific experiment. Though many consider it a fictional legend, the story is unsettling enough to blur the line between fact and fiction. Brace yourself as we dive into the details of one of the most disturbing experiments ever imagined. In the depths of a remote Soviet military research facility, a group of scientists initiated a classified experiment to study the effects of extreme sleep deprivation. The subjects chosen for this experiment were 5 political prisoners, considered enemies of the state. They were promised freedom if they participated and managed to stay awake for 30 consecutive days. The prisoners, desperate for freedom, reluctantly agreed. To ensure the subjects remained awake, the scientists pumped an experimental stimulant gas into a sealed chamber where the prisoners were kept. The room was carefully monitored through microphones, cameras, and reinforced one-way mirrors. There were no beds, only cots without bedding, a basic toilet, books, and enough dried food to last the full month. The conditions were designed to deprive the prisoners not only of sleep, but also of comfort and control. The scientists were eager to see how long the human mind and body could endure without sleep. What followed was far worse than anyone could have imagined. The first few days of the experiment passed without any significant issues. The prisoners talked freely among themselves, discussing their lives and the circumstances that led them there. Their conversations were monitored, and their physical condition was recorded, with no signs of unusual distress. However, as the days progressed, subtle changes began to take hold. The prisoners became increasingly irritable and paranoid. Their conversations turned dark as they began to recount traumatic experiences from their past. The effects of sleep deprivation started to show. Their laughter became forced, their words slower and more disjointed. By the 5th day, tension filled the chamber. Their tempers grew short, and arguments erupted more frequently. Still, nothing too alarming had happened, and the scientists were intrigued by the early results. On the 6th day, the situation in the chamber took a disturbing turn. The prisoners stopped talking to one another entirely, choosing instead to sit in silence. The microphones picked up faint whispers, but nothing that could be understood. They began to exhibit signs of paranoia, each one retreating into themselves, staring at the walls, or pacing frantically around the room. On the 9th day, one of the prisoners suddenly screamed at the top of his lungs, running back and forth in the chamber as if trying to escape something only he could see. He screamed continuously for hours, his voice growing hoarse and weak until he could barely produce a sound. The other prisoners didn't react. They simply watched in silence, their eyes wide and hollow. Soon after, another prisoner began to scream. Instead of running, though, he tore apart the books they had been given, scattering the pages across the floor and smearing them with his own feces. He plastered the pages over the windows, blocking the scientists' view of the chamber. On the 10th day, the researchers could no longer see inside the chamber. The microphones picked up no sounds beyond faint whispers and occasional scratching noises. Concerned but unwilling to intervene, the scientists debated whether to open the chamber. The experiment was far from over, but the silence was unsettling. Suddenly, a voice came through the intercom. One of the prisoners whispered, "We no longer want to be freed." The researchers were shocked. They debated whether the prisoners had become delusional or if something else was happening. The decision was made to open the chamber and assess the situation. On the 15th day, the scientists drained the stimulant gas from the chamber and opened the door. What they found inside was beyond comprehension. 4 of the 5 prisoners were still alive, but barely recognizable as human. The food rations hadn't been touched for days. The prisoners had mutilated themselves and one another. Deep wounds covered their bodies, some of which had been inflicted with their bare hands. Flesh had been ripped from their own bodies, and in some cases, they had consumed it. Their eyes were wild, filled with a desperate manic hunger. Despite their grievous injuries, none of them seemed to feel pain. When the researchers tried to remove the prisoners from the chamber, they resisted violently. One prisoner screamed for the gas to be turned back on, begging to stay awake. As they were forcibly restrained and taken to a medical facility for treatment, the prisoners fought with superhuman strength. It took multiple guards to subdue each one, and one of the prisoners died during the struggle. His body was torn apart by the others before they could be separated. During the medical examination, the remaining prisoners were found to have been awake for all 15 days, despite their injuries and self-inflicted mutilations. They exhibited unnatural strength, resilience, and an overwhelming desire to stay awake. Any attempt to sedate them or put them to sleep was met with extreme violence. As the doctors tried to treat their wounds, the prisoners screamed in terror, pleading to be kept awake. They feared falling asleep more than death itself. One of them, his vocal cords destroyed from screaming, whispered through broken gasps that he could hear them, the things that were waiting for him if he fell asleep. One by one, the prisoners died from their injuries, with one final prisoner left alive. As the scientists prepared to perform a final interrogation, he grinned through his bloody teeth and asked, "Have you forgotten so easily? We are you." He paused, eyes filled with an eerie clarity, and whispered, "We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be set free at every moment in your deepest, darkest minds. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread." With that, the last surviving prisoner was shot by one of the horrified researchers. The experiment was officially shut down, and the surviving data was buried, hidden from the world. To this day, no one knows if the Russian sleep experiment ever truly happened. It remains one of the most terrifying stories to emerge from the dark corners of the internet. But whether or not it's real, the story serves as a haunting reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the horrors that can be unleashed when we push beyond our natural limits. The Russian sleep experiment is a tale that chills to the bone, and it leaves us with one unsettling thought. What if the worst monsters we could ever face are the ones already lurking inside us?